As a last sort of exercise before we move on from the topic of UVs, I'd like to challenge you to unwrap our Melvin character. So you can find this file in the downloads, and Melvin's just a friendly character that we have as sort of a mascot around CG Cookie. First, before anything else, we're going to create a test grid just so that we can make sure that our unwrap is nice and smooth without too much pinching or stretching. So over in the UV editor, I'm going to click New up here, and that way we can create a new image. And I'll just call this checker texture. I'll leave everything at the defaults, except I'll change the generated type from blank to UV grid. That'll give us a nice black and white texture to work with, and we can click OK. And now we have our grid. Just to make sure that this is saved with the file, I'll go to File, External Data, and pack all into .blend. Then next time we save our file, this texture will be saved with it. I'll also click the shield icon, and that way it won't be deleted if it's not being used, so it'll always be around in this file. So now we can start unwrapping. First, I'd recommend you pause the video right here and try it for yourself first. So without any direction or any help from me, try to unwrap this Melvin character so that this checker texture lays evenly across his entire body, his eyes, his horns, and everything. So give that a shot, pause the video, and come back when you're done. Okay, did you do it? Did you really do it? Okay, well, either way, let's continue on. So the first thing that I want to do here is just give Melvin a basic unwrap just to see where things stand. So I'll hit A to select everything, U and unwrap, and it's a pretty rough start. But I'll turn on live unwrap, and that way we can just do this pretty quickly. I'll go to UV and turn on live unwrap. And again, in later versions of Blender, this will be under the options menu. Okay, so then I will also go to edge select mode here and turn on sync selection in the UV editor. That way I don't have to have everything selected here. And I'll also want to have this selected in the shader editor so that it shows up here. So I'll quickly go over to the shader editor, Shift A, add a texture and image texture. Select that checker texture and plug that into the base color. All right, so now we can see that on the model, and we can go back to our UV editing workspace. And we can either use solid view or we can use material preview mode, whichever one works for you. So first, let's do some of the smaller pieces and get those out of the way first. So let's start with the horns, because there's some pretty easy targets to tackle. As you might expect, we just select an edge loop. I'll select the bottom kind of left here. And we can look at the tip. Well, actually, let's just unwrap this first. I'll right click and mark seam. And if we zoom in really close on this, you'll see the tip is kind of squished a little bit. So I'll also choose one of these triangles here right in the center, right click and mark seam for that as well. And now you can see that's been nicely split. So just minimize stretching there, and I'll do the same thing on this other side. And for some reason, I just noticed that we have symmetry turned on here, which we're not doing any modeling, but I'm going to turn symmetry off just in case, because it's not going to mirror our UV seams anyway, and can definitely cause some confusion. So now let's choose that same area for the second seam, right along this horn here, and also choosing one of those edges leading up to the pointed triangle. Right click and mark seam. And there we go. So once we've done unwrapping a portion of the model, what I'm going to do is hit Control and L, and I'll select this one as well, Control and L, and then hide these from view. So just hit H to hide, and now we don't have to worry about it, and it's not going to be messy in our UV view. So I'll go around and do some of these quick objects first. I'll do the teeth here, which are going to be about exactly the same as the horns. Choose that inside seam. Select that one right there. And let's choose the same one on this side, Alt and Shift. Select that edge loop, Shift select that one that leads up to the triangle, and right click and mark seam. Once we're sure that looks pretty good, then we can hit Control and L, and then H to hide. Next, let's do the eyes. Those should be pretty easy, but they're kind of like embedded inside of his head, and I don't really want to work like that. It's a lot easier to move these out of the way. And so if we don't want to hide and unhide everything, because if we hit Alt-H to unhide everything, then the teeth and the horns come back too. So one trick that I like to use when modeling or texturing sometimes is to select the objects that we want to focus on, hit Control-L to select just them, and then move them along the Y-axis a set amount of units. So if I just hit 1, it looks like they receded back into his head, so I'll hit negative to go in the negative direction, and now they're sitting out in front. But since I moved them exactly 1 unit, then when I move them exactly 1 unit back, they'll be right where they started. So this is called exploding your model, and it can definitely be a helpful practice. So I'll choose a line right down the center of these icospheres, these stretched icospheres. It's kind of a weird one to unwrap because there are no actual edge loops. So I'll just kind of select the ones in the back. I'll default to, if I need to go one way or the other, I'll default to going backwards so that the seam is less apparent, and hopefully we won't be able to see it from the front of his head. But I'll kind of zigzag my way around here. Right click and mark seam. There we go. That looks like it's totally fine. And actually, we don't need a seam going around the entire model. We could probably get away with just taking off the seam over here. Right click and clear seam. Let's see if that works. To just have these tied together in the middle. And let's select all of these and move them over and see if there's too much stretching. So I'll scale them up temporarily. And it looks like that does cause some stretching. So maybe we want a couple more seams. I'll place one there and there. Mark seam. And there we go. So now it's just one island. We don't have to worry about moving multiple islands around. And that seems to work. Okay. So let's do the same thing on this side. Doesn't have to be exactly the same, but should be roughly symmetrical. So select these edges here. Going up, and then I'll skip a couple and then come back down on this side. And I think that's where we left off there. Yep, that's about right. So right click and mark seam, and there we have it. All right, so now we can select an edge on both of these, hit Control L to select everything that's linked to them, then hit G, X, or excuse me, Y, and 1, and those pop right back into place. Then I can hit H to hide, and now we can work on the rest of the model. So right now, Melvin is looking pretty rough. We need at least one big seam cutting him in half somewhere. And usually the best place to do that is right down the back. So I'll select some of these edges here in the back, and I'll use the Control and left click hotkey to select the shortest path. And it's going to be kind of sewn together like a teddy bear here. And I already have this set to tag seam under edge tag, but if it's set to select, then just set that to tag seam, and then we'll be good to go. So it's still a little bit too much stretching around here, so I'll select up on the top of his head as well. And let's continue down to about there. We might need one more edge just to reduce stretching, but let's leave it there for now. And then continue on down the bottom here. Right to the middle, and see where we're at. Okay, so it's a little bit hard to tell with the checkerboard pattern. It's kind of noisy and getting in the way. So I'm going to turn on that stretched view by hitting N, going to View, and turning on Overlays and Stretching. Again, in later versions of Blender, this will be up in the top right in the Overlays popover. But now we can actually see our UVs a little bit more clearly against the background. So this is looking pretty good. He does kind of look like a teddy bear there, or like a gummy bear. One thing that'd be really helpful though is taking off his arms, because they're definitely being shrunk down way too small here on both sides. So what I'll do is just take the outside of his arms, and then I'll Alt and Shift, select that edge loop, right click and mark seam. That way that separates it from his body, or the main portion of his body. Alt and Shift, and I could use the edge tag either way totally works fine. So that's definitely going to help here with the main part of the body. But now for this, we just need to give this another seam so that his arms can lay flat. And I think a good way to do that would be to add a seam around the back and then move that all the way up to his thumb, because his thumb needs to be split as well. But I don't want to separate it completely if I can help it. Since whoever's going to be using this UV map is going to be texture painting things by hand, it would really help if we have as few islands as possible. So the first thing I'm going to try is just putting a seam right down the back. I'll select that edge right there, and then hold Control, left click and select this one here, and continue this all the way up and towards his thumb. And I think that works fairly well, though I'd actually rather continue this seam up and through his thumb and see if we can just slice that right in half there. Otherwise, we're going to have to make a ring around the thumb, and I don't want to do that. So I'll hit Control Z and undo this, And instead, let's try the edge loop right below it. Again, I'll select that one, hold Control and left click, and bring this up and around. And now I can bring this up and towards his thumb. Okay, so that's looking good, though we may need to split this section off a little bit. So I'll add a couple seams on either side. And I'll continue adding seams until it looks like there's no stretching, and that actually looks pretty good. Okay, so I'll call this done for this side, and then we'll copy that exact same thing on this other side. So again, just take this little tiny edge right in the back here, right in the back part of the armpit, Control left click, and edge tag these all the way up to the side of the thumb, and then create a couple cuts like so. Let's see, how far did I get on this side? You know, I may as well just continue this up until that edge loop there. That way it kind of just folds outwards naturally. So I'll do the same thing on this side. I'll take both of these edges, right click, mark seam, and there we go. Okay, so that looks pretty good. There's, as you can see, a little bit of stretching here where the meaty part of his hands are a little bit bigger than up near the shoulders and armpits. We can try adding a couple seams, but I don't think it's going to be super necessary, so I wouldn't really worry about that too much. One thing that we haven't really touched on yet or tried is the minimize stretch command in the UV editor. So we can give that a shot and see if that helps. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it hurts, but we may as well give it a try. So I'm going to, let's turn sync selection off for now. Select everything in the 3D view so that it shows up in the UV editor, and select these two islands as big mittens, and then go to UV and minimize stretch. So if we scroll on our mouse wheel now, we can blend between two different methods of fixing the stretching. And as you can see, as we scroll down, this introduces more angle stretching, but it does kind of even out the checkerboard pattern as it goes towards his fists there. So we can hit Control Z and Control Shift Z to see which one we like better. Frankly, I think the original works a little bit better in this case, so I'm not going to worry about that there. But maybe we can add a couple more seams just to reduce the stretching a little bit more. So what I'll try to do is maybe add a seam right along the back here, along these three edges. Right click, mark seam, and maybe one along the thumb. Right click, mark seam. Let's turn sync selection back on so that I can see what's going on. And it looks like that other seam introduced some overlap there, so we definitely don't want that. I'll right click and clear that seam. We could try splitting this section here. Right click and mark seam. And as long as that doesn't create any overlap, we can see that it does indeed help with the stretching. And I'm pretty happy with this result. So again, there's still a little bit here, and we can tweak that in a bit. But for now, I think this looks a little bit better than this left side. So let's copy those same actions over here. And so we just went up kind of by the knuckles there and up over here. And again, it's more seams can be an issue sometimes when painting. They might turn out to be a little bit too obvious. And so we want to try to minimize that. But at the same time, we also want to minimize stretch. So it's up to you, depending on what your project is, how high the resolution of the textures are, and things like that. And let's make sure I got the same ones. Let's see, the one right down the middle there and one to the side. Oh, I think I missed that. So let me clear these really quick. Right click, clear seam, and choose these instead. Right click, mark seam. And now we can try a couple of the other UV tools to try to minimize the stretching in these areas. So hit T to open up the toolbar, and we can expand this so we can read the names of what's what. And let's use the relax tool to kind of expand some of these areas. So hit F to scale the brush here, or you can right click at the header and show tool settings. There you can see we have the radius control and the strength control. So let's turn the strength down quite a bit. I don't want it to be too strong. And then let's find the area where his mitts are. Looks like this one's the one on the right. And that definitely stretches things inwards. So let's try using the pinch tool and then using control to go in the opposite direction and push things outwards. I'll turn the strength down pretty small, turn the radius up. And we can slowly see if that helps at all. And we can kind of just like sculpt the shape of these checkerboard patterns and the size of these areas. So this is kind of like the manual way of doing it, of evening things out. Or alternatively, what we could do is just go back to our select tools and turn on proportional editing up here in the header and choose connected only. And that way, once we select an area, let's say we select that edge there, we could scale it up or scale it down. And it looks like it just doesn't actually work with sync selection on. So that's definitely interesting. I thought for sure that it did, but you see this works a lot better with sync selection off. Perhaps that's a bug, I'm not sure. But we can take some of these areas here, and if we want more resolution, just scale them up slightly. And if you scroll up on your mouse wheel, then it'll influence more areas around that area. So let's say we want to scale this part up, and maybe this part down. So we can just massage the UVs like that. And it doesn't need to be exactly perfect, but something that's reasonably proportional. Okay, so let's call that good there. And then we can take these and then just hide them from view. So I'll select both of these, hit Control L, and it only selected up to the arms because that's where the seams are. So if we look at this, there's an option for limiting this to the seams. So if we set this to normal or material, then it'll select everything. But if we set this to seam, then it'll stop right at that seam around the arms. So then I can hit H to hide those faces there. And now we have an armless Melvin, and we can continue on with the rest of the body.